Hi, my name is Tyler Dorsey. I'm an applied mathematics student at San Jose State. Currently, I'm taking the class Engineering 100W. Our final project for my group is called Marine Conservation. The group is comprised of 4 members: myself, Tyler Dorsey, Marcia Briseno, Gabriel Diaz, and Ethan Hinman. So to start us off with, we want to start with a formal definition of what exactly is marine conservation. According to Science Daily, the definition of marine conservation is the protection and preservation of our seas. It also focuses on limiting human-caused damage within the system and aims at preserving marine species. So there comes a question with this, which is, why is this important, especially for our humankind? Because this is essentially more work. The reason why it's important is because most of the planet is covered in water, 71% specifically. A lot of our food comes from the ocean, as well as most of the oxygen that we breathe. It ends up coming from the ocean as well, which is created by phytoplankton and other marine animals and species and plants that live within it. So if they go away, we go away. So eventually this is actually our own problem. Our group has kind of taken apart and analyzed this problem as a whole. This is a very large problem and is going to require a very large solution. Because of that, we've decided that this problem is a little bit too big for us to solve, but we've decided to start it off. The purpose of our presentation is to diagnose this issue, separate it out into 4 different categories, with the hopes that another group in the future will be able to continue our work. That being said, the 4 groups that our group has decided to focus on are the 4 topics. The first one is marine conservation, second being that of marine pollution, third is that of climate change and how it affects the ocean environment. And last but not least is overfishing, as well as the possible effects from it, as well as maybe future consequences. And with that, I hand this over to Ethan Hinman. Continuing on, I'd like to continue on with the topic of ecosystems, specifically marine ecosystems. This is going to be actually a short part of our report, mainly because there's really just 5 main marine ecosystems, and those being the Nearctic zone, the oceanic zone, the supralittoral zone, the intertidal zone, and the sublittoral zone. As we kind of know just from regular human biology and just biology in general, a lot of species are interdependent upon each other. The same thing goes inside a marine environment. So to give a more specific description, the Nearctic zone happens to be at a depth of around 200 meters, and it's basically mainly dominated by a lot of algae, which a lot of different smaller animals are more or less dependent on. The next zone, the oceanic zone, it's mainly open water, and a lot of plankton / zooplankton, whatever. They're mainly the dominant species there, and a lot of whales and a lot of larger mammals actually are dependent upon them for survival. The supralittoral zone, otherwise known as the splash zone, is the area above the high tide lines. And so you can kind of start to see how a lot of these different zones and sectors are really just overlapping and really touching on each other. The intertidal zone, it's the area between the low and the high zone, and the range is actually pretty short. It's almost around like 5 meters or so. It's around like 30 feet. So it's around from when, if you go to a beach, the beach starts around 30 feet depth in the water, and all the different living creatures that are involved in there. The last one, the sublittoral zone, it's the area between the low tide and the continental shelf. Now, this range for this zone is actually pretty deep. It's 150 to 300 meters. And if you think about it, that's around 900 feet. So you're going down really, really super far. It's kind of like sandwiched in between the oceanic zone. And so the main point here is to kind of point out that all these different zones are interconnected with each other. They're touching on each other, as well as the animals that happen to live within these environments are interconnected with one another, and if one ends up going, then the other one is obviously going to start feeling its effects. So for example, in the oceanic zone, you have plankton and zooplankton. If you start throwing in trash, or if the marine environment there starts becoming unsustainable, that's going to naturally trickle down to the whale population and whatnot. So to continue on, you actually start off with the root cause, which happens to be marine pollution. To continue on, I would like to cover the topic of marine pollution. Now, Merriam-Webster's definition of pollution goes as follows. It's the action of polluting, especially by environmental contamination with man-made waste. So when it comes to marine pollution, there are 4 different topics I would like to talk about. Specifically, microplastics, oil spills, acoustic interference by shipping vessels, and the last of which is eutrophication. So when it comes to microplastics, what exactly is a microplastic? Well, micro in the name means super small. And the scientific term means 10 to the negative 6 meters. Specifically, in this case, it's any plastic that is dumped within the ocean that is less than 5 millimeters in diameter. So what happens when we dump all this stuff into the ocean, right? So we have a lot of living marine animals within the ocean. Well, what ends up going on is that it either gets collected in the ocean, in which case it causes debris and whatnot, or it's actually ingested by fish. So the effects of which on fish that ingest this is actually not really quite known. And this brings up a whole other problem, which is that a lot of humans' food, a lot of our food actually comes from the ocean. So let's just say, for instance, what happens if a fish injects, digests microplastics? And what happens if that fish ends up getting caught and then being eaten by a human? We actually don't quite know what goes on there. But the thing is that plastic is not a natural element of our environment, and so more likely than not, it's probably not the best thing for us. Another thing about microplastics is that it actually takes thousands of years to decompose. So they're really not biodegradable. They don't compose overnight. This is going to take a long time to get rid of, but we're pumping it out faster than they are decomposing, So the last of which is that microplastics, most of which happen to be buoyant. And whenever you have water, anything that's buoyant is going to float, right? When it floats, it's either going to block sunlight to specific plants or it's going to collect together, right? Now, the researchers at the University of Ottawa empirically drove the system of connection between marine species and microplastics. So they end up giving sort of like a chart as to microplastics and how they particularly flow within a species, right? So let's just say you have a microplastic that is sort of ingested or taken on by a plant, like a marine plant, right? It ends up picking it up. That goes into the fish. The fish ends up going into another fish and whatnot, and it basically disturbs the whole series. Think of kind of like a domino effect. Once you put something in, it's really hard to stop it because it's going to start affecting all the other dominoes, right? Turns out there was a multiple Atlantic sampling that showed that 19.8 of all species ingested a version of microplastics. And of that percentage, 32.7 ingested more than one piece, right? This is not necessarily a great thing. So we somehow need to kind of figure out how exactly to change this. This is not a sustainable way for our future. To continue on with oil and shipping pollution, an example of oil pollution are specifically like an oil spill, the BP oil spill in 2010 and whatnot, or anything else like that. These are kind of the more or less famous top versions of marine pollution. It's very, very popular to go with these ones, but they cause a lot of damage. Like the Deepwater Horizon oil spill ended up being miles within radius, coating marine life as well as aviation life and whatnot. And it's actually still taking up work to this day to clean up. Shipping pollution can come into two different areas, one of which is ballast water dumping, which is that whenever a ship, let's just say from England, it will bring in water within its tanks. In England, it will actually take the bacteria from that environment. If it goes down to South America, where it needs to drop off its load, it will actually dump out that ballast water. That ballast water has the bacteria from the northern hemisphere, which is now being dumped into the southern hemisphere. So you're now introducing a brand new species, bacteria, viruses, who knows, into a different area. Fortunately, there have actually been quite a few restrictions and regulations on this, but it could definitely be a little bit better because this somewhat goes a little unchecked. The last thing of shipping pollution is actually acoustic interference. And acoustic interference happens when you have a shipping vessel, and what ends up going on is that it has a certain pathway that it needs to follow, right? And ships have very large engines because they need to go from one place to the next. And it emits acoustic interference with the frequency of the engine. Now, if you don't know, a lot of whales and or fish actually navigate acoustically. They'll use their own version of sonar. That's how the United States Navy ended up getting sonar, was by us viewing the marine life. And it turns out in Norway, the whales and the cod that cross a very popular shipping line are continuously confused and disturbed by acoustic pollution given off by passing vessels. This is actually taking place in Love, Norway. It's the name of the place, Love, Norway. The researchers at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology found that a frequency as low as 30 hertz can actually disturb the local marine life. So 30 hertz is very, very small, and it's not a whole lot to disturb what's going on there. So we need to kind of take a better look at that, as well as to figure out future solutions for that if we can possibly get around that. The last of which I would like to talk about is the idea of eutrophication. Now, eutrophication is the process by which rich nutrients collect in a body of water and make it uninhabitable for marine life. You might have actually seen this in sort of like a pond. It typically takes place in a body of water that is isolated. So think of like a pond where there's a lot of scum on the surface and whatnot. And what ends up going on is that if you have a lot of phosphorus and nitrogen, if they collect within that pond or body of water, it will slowly start killing off all of the life or marine life that are attached to it. So, like I said, such processes, they're most common in lagoons, lakes, and large bodies of water that are connected to the ocean, and if this process goes on, it's going to eventually harm the local marine life. But actually, more or less, it's connected to the human race, because humans will get their drinking water from these particular places, right? So that actually makes the job of the water filtering company much more harder to do. So we should kill two birds with one stone and be more regulatory on this action. It'll be better for our drinking water in the long run, as well as for the local marine life. Now, there's actually a lot of physics that goes on with eutrophication. And so, like I mentioned earlier, there's a bunch of phosphorus and nitrogen that kind of mix together. And if they clump up too much, the local life actually starts dying. Turns out that the Guangdong laboratory researchers in China actually drove mathematical formulas for modeling for this. And they ended up giving it away for free for all the scientists around the world, so that the different scientists can actually test for different levels of eutrophication. You can actually see these formulas within our PowerPoint that's attached to this. They actually talk about specifically the weight of the difference. They give ratios for the different weight of phosphorus as well as nitrogen. And so you can compare the weights of your phosphorus and nitrogen in the ratios to global data points. And so you can actually get a good comparison on what's a healthy level for your local body of water versus what is an unhealthy level. And with that, I'll hand this over to Marcia for her report on climate change.
Hello everybody, so my name is Marcia Briceño, and today I will be discussing the effects of climate change on the marine system. Within this topic, I will talk about subtopics, and they will be how the climate change affects and generates warmer or colder waters throughout the ocean. My second topic will be how it damages habitats. Third will be how it affects ocean currents, and last but not least will be how it affects marine life. My first topic, which is how climate change generates warmer or colder waters. Basically, what it does is that with climate change and how the climate is rising in temperature, what it will do is that on the ocean, it will warm up the surface. And so what it does is that where the water is supposed to be cold, because of the surface, it's becoming warmer. And so that's affecting where the water should be warm or cold, and it's fluctuating across the ocean. Now, there is another problem where warmer waters, where they're not supposed to be at, it can affect the ocean. And so one topic that I would like to talk about is coastal upwelling. So coastal upwelling is when the wind displaces water deeper into the ocean across the surface. And so on the coast, what it will do from the bottom of the ocean, it will rise to the top in order to replace the displaced water that was removed through the wind. And so what that will do is that the surface will be warm, and that's the water that will move. But then now we have water from the bottom of the ocean that comes up through the coast, and now we got a combination of water and warm waters, where either we're supposed to have warmer waters or colder waters. And so that can really be affected, and especially in the marine life, because at the bottom where the water is colder, there is more of a nutrient-rich water, and so many marine life can really benefit from that. But when it becomes warm and now we're getting a mix of this, some species are not getting as many nutrients as they should. Now, going on to my second topic, which is how climate change damages habitats. I just talked about how the warmer and the fluctuating of warmer or colder waters affect some habitats. Now, there is more to just warmer, colder waters. We also have another topic, which is it's mainly another problem, and so that is ocean acidification. And so what that does, basically, the CO2 that's in the air and which causes climate change gets absorbed into the water, and so we get a combination of CO2 and HO2, which creates an acid base. And so what that does, it really affects many habitats in the ocean because it creates like an acid form. And so that's when we start to see coral reef to bleach, and once it bleaches, it dies. So that is one example of ocean acidification and how it affects habitats. And so another thing is ocean oxygen reduction. So basically what the CO2 in the ocean reduces oxygen throughout oceans. And so species can really be affected by that. Species, although they are underwater, they still need oxygen to survive, and so that can really impact habitats throughout the ocean. Now, another problem that climate change does, how it damages habitats, is rising seawater levels. So one example is polar bears. And so as climate change, basically temperatures rise, ice throughout the ocean melts, and so what it does, it creates seawater levels to rise. And so we may not think that's a problem. However, where polar bears live, that can really be affected because what polar bears live on top of ice. And so if the ice melts and melts and melts, they only have a small portion where they can rest and sleep and live. They cannot live on the water, because sometimes if there's not an ice where they can rest at, they can drown. Yes, they do swim, but they can drown. So polar bears are really affected by climate change, and this is not the only species that can be seen affected by climate change, but many other habitats such as coral reef and many other species. Going on to my third topic is that climate change can affect ocean currents. And so basically the earth has a current where the ocean currents flow through. And so in certain areas, the ocean current should be cold, and certain areas, the ocean current should be warm. Now, with the surface of the water rising in temperature, where it's supposed to be cold, that can really be affected, because species live in a certain temperature water. And so if cold water species need cold water, and now we have climate change, which is basically rising the water at the surface. And so as they mix, the ocean currents, as they flow, when they mix, species would have to shift. And they cannot adapt to those kind of situations. And so there's another form of how it could damage the ocean. Also, out of place temperature water. So the water circulation needs a flow, and it needs the water to be at temperature level. So the change in temperature waters can really affect circulation throughout the entire earth and the ocean currents. Now, going on to my last topic is how climate change affects marine life in directly or indirectly. And so, one way was how I mentioned that through how it generates warmer or colder waters, how it damages habitats in many ways, and how it affects ocean currents. These are some of the ways that climate change affects marine life. Now, one thing that was discussed on a green talk that we reviewed was, I thought it was really interesting what Monica Chen discussed. She talked about how basically humans, we are over consuming seafood, and how it's really affecting the marine life. We're like overfishing and over consuming, and we're basically taking all these species and animals out of the ocean, and we're eating them. So this can really disrupt many marine species. So humans, and whether it's directly or indirectly, whether we may not intend to affect marine life, we do it still in many ways. So if we can somehow reduce greenhouse gases, that can really be that can really have an impact on the ocean, and maybe help the ocean conservation, or even just reducing the food that we intake from the ocean. Thank you, and now I will hand it over on to Gabe.
Hi, today I'll be discussing about overfishing. So what is overfishing? Overfishing is the act of fishing at a high quantity that does not allow the population to regenerate. So when did this start? A lot of people think this started probably 20, 50 years ago, but actually this started in the early 1800s when people were hunting for whales and using their blubber for lambs. So where does this occur? Well, the ocean is a big part of the world. But some of the main hotspots would be Atlantic coast, California, European coast, and the Mediterranean. So how does overfishing occur? So in the early 1800s, we had a population of about 1 billion. Within the next 2 years, now we're at 2000. The population is over 7 billion. So we need a lot of food, a lot of high quantity food to supply the world. And obviously fish is very important to our nutrition. And my next slide, regeneration. We're going to see two graphs. The first graph is the Pacific sardine biomass from 2005 to 2017. As you can see, in the early 2005-2006 era, these sardines were at a very high population, but after that, it tremendously declined in population. 2013 and forward, they were below the cutoff, so that means their population is going to be very hard to regenerate if overfishing does not stop. And the next image, that's labeled 2010, we see multiple fish species labeled on this graph. We see the Atlantic cod, which is in a very hot spot, Atlantic coast, the black-nosed shark, the yellowtail flounder, and the Acadian redfish. So if you are to the right of the vertical axis, that means you're at a very good position for that fish stock in terms of volume. If you're above the x-axis, that means you're fishing that specific species at a very high rate. As you can tell, the Atlantic cod is being fished at a very high rate since it is in the Atlantic hotspot, and the population is now very low. But now as you look at the Acadian redfish, it's not really being overfished, very slow rate, and the population still has a very good standing. And my next slide, extinction, we're going to be talking about what species are going extinct and why. So the first species would be albacore tuna, which you can see in the image. The Atlantic cod, as I stated earlier, is in one of the Atlantic hotspots. Sharks, rays, and whales, and more. Most people don't know, but sharks and rays are actually going very extinct. They're being hunted for their medicinal use and for trophies. As I stated earlier, whales are being hunted for their blubber. So why? So they're being fished for food, supplies. A lot of the species are actually dying by bycatch from other species, and a lot of them are also being fished for trophies. More than 90% of the European species are going extinct due to the very low, weak regulation. As you can see in the image, probably about 100 million or more sharks are killed every year by bycatch. In my next slide, destruction of habitat, I'll be discussing about the ecosystem of the ocean. So, let's say you have less predators due to overfishing. Now there's more prey, which leads to more disease being spread around. Since there are a lot more prey than there are predators, and the prey's immune system are not as tough as the predator, they do tend to spread disease a lot easier than any other species. Obviously, this is very toxic to the ecosystem of the ocean. Every species rely on each other, and if there's a lack of nutrients and unhealthy ecosystem, obviously a lot more species tend to die. So the big question, will the ocean ever run out of fish? In my next slide, solutions, I will say yes and no. So if we don't stop overfishing, yes, there will run out of fish. Obviously, we want to stop overfishing so that we can answer it as a no. One way the U.S. has been helping to stop overfishing is by creating the Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Conservation and Management Reauthorization Act of 2006. Yes, a very long name. So what this does is establish right-based fisheries, which are funded, and they are set up in certain areas to catch certain species. As well as this act also establishes catch limits for these fisheries and making all the fisheries accountable for their fishing. So like I said, if a fishery is in a certain place, catching a certain species, then if that species ever goes extinct or is being overfished at a very high rate, we know who to hold accountable. Another solution would be to set up social and economic incentives. By this I mean by like private fisheries. If you set up social incentives, like let's say a company has a bad reputation, does not care about the environment, the society is probably going to stop buying supplies from them. Obviously they're going to lose money, and that's not what they want. But if a company starts to attend good standing with the society, then obviously society is going to want to buy their supplies because they know that company is going to be providing good health for the ecosystem and to stop overfishing. Obviously, the more people buy from their company, that creates economic incentives because they do gain a lot more money. And at the end of the day, which company does not want more money? Great. Thank you.
In conclusion, I would like to start out with large problems require large solutions. Now, if you remember, Alexander the Great actually conquered the ancient world, not all at once, but small pieces at a time. So specifically, this is what our group has been trying to do, and hopefully that we accomplish with this presentation, is there's the large problem of conserving the marine environment. And that's actually very, very a hard task for just 4 people to do, or one group for one semester. So we hope that with this presentation, we've been able to define, analyze, and hopefully diagnose the issues going forth with marine conservation. We have a hope that a future group, either from San Jose State or just in general, will be able to take the reins on this. Because this is a large task that's going to require a lot of people from different sorts of fields. Mathematicians, engineers, physicists, biologists, and whatnot. I would like to close with it's how important this task is for marine conservation, because when it comes down to it, marine conservation is directly correlated to the survival of the human race. It is estimated that by 2050 there will be more plastic than fish in the ocean. The current year is 2020. If you do the difference, that's a 30-year difference. So within 30 years there'll be more plastic than fish in the ocean. If this process goes unchecked, it is estimated that the human race will become extinct within 80 years after the last fish dies. That's a very dire consequence. And I'm not quite sure about you, but I would like to see my grandkids. Anyways, just to kind of put it all into perspective, thank you for listening to our presentation on marine conservation. Thank you.